Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is a poet, fictionist, photographer, Sunday columnist, lawyer, and radio host commentator. He has a BA in journalism, filmmaking, an MA in creative writing from New Mexico State University, and a JD from Harvard Law School. He has also driven a cab in New York City, practiced law for decades in San Francisco, delivered the late night news in English on Taiwan, and wandered through China, Tibet, Peru, and Mexico. He's crossed the U.S. on motorcycles many times. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Peter P. Goodman.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Peter, our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Well, I was thinking of my first book was probably when I was about 6 years old. I took a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and split it into quarters and wrote on it as if, because you could open it, and wrote a novel that basically was Roy rode up to the corral and said, "Where's Joe?" And they shot at him, bang, 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 ping, ouch, that sort of thing. And then years later, after was a college dropout driving a cab in New York and run the youth center in Harlem, I wandered out to New Mexico, and I ended up writing a novel for my thesis to get the first master's in creative writing here. And that novel, basically a couple of publishers and a couple of agents looked at it and they all said about the same thing, which was nicely written. It's a good read, but you're nobody. If this were in an airport shelf, nobody's going to recognize it. It's not a genre like science fiction or mystery. So, we could bring it out as a second book. And I have to tell a story that might inspire some people. That, of course, crushed me until I read a book called The Fortunate Pilgrim. Have you ever read that?
No, I haven't.
It was the first book published or written by, but the third book copyrighted by an Italian-American who grew up in Hell's Kitchen, New York, the 50s, a long time ago. And he wrote this novel about growing up in that area. And it was delightful. But even after he wrote The Godfather, nobody really read that.
How about that?
But I liked it. Anyway.
That's inspirational.
And then I wrote another novel when I was traveling in Asia. I thought I might like to write a mystery set in some country. And when I got to Tibet, certain ways one person I saw die, but another way someone could die, presented themselves as ways somebody could be murdered and it wouldn't be clear. And I also got fascinated with, of course, the conflict between the native Tibetans and their Chinese masters, and just tried to see both sides and have somebody in the novel discuss them. But that one, I got a publisher interested finally, but I went back to law work in the city of San Francisco right at the wrong time to be, doing the changes they requested.
Well, where do you think you developed such a sense of adventure? I'm always interested when wandering souls travel the world, with many of them becoming expats.
You know, I think a couple things, and I almost did. I thought I was going to stay in Taiwan, and then years later, I wandered around Peru looking for a place to live, but I came back. Um, I think there's this stupid story from when I'm a kid. I'm in first grade, and I'm in the back, and I have my shoes off, and the teacher said, "Put your shoes on," and I said, um, you know, I said, "I don't know how. I don't know how to tie them." And she knew better, of course, and I didn't realize how obvious my lie was, but she said, "Of course you know." And she was impatient, and I thought in my mind, well, what if I couldn't tie him? And she's just acting like this. So I actually threw a shoe at her and hit her. And in our little school, that was such an event that for the rest of my childhood till high school, I was basically, if you wanted to yell a bad word or say something wise or do something you weren't supposed to do in class, the way you got it done without danger was you said, "Peter, I'll bet you wouldn't," whatever it was. And and then politically, of course, I got being a civil rights worker and arguing against the war, whatnot. And I think I just sort of wandered out, I don't know, wandered out of mainstream America for a long time.
I was one of those kids who would take a dare. I was a real tomboy, what they called a tomboy back then, rough and tumble with the boys. And if one of them asked me to jump off the roof or dared me to, I would do that. So I understand that.
Yeah, so later in life, I wandered all through China and much of Tibet. You couldn't go to that much of Tibet at that point, and later Peru, and just really enjoyed it.
Well, after all your travels, where's the one place that you would want to visit again or even live there?
Great question. Um, a town I really liked when I was there was Dali, a small town about um, several hours northwest of Kunming in Western China. And it was, you know, that area of China has most of their 55 ethnic minorities, and or at least half of them are there. Um, and it's just colorful and interesting and beautiful mountains. And I certainly love it. It's also they're so unused to seeing uh, foreigners that when I wandered through on my way to Tibet, through part of that area, not Dali, but north of there, if I'd be in town in the village shooting pool or something, people would come up and let's see if I get this on here. And I'd be shooting pool and they'd come over and pet my hand because it had hair on it and they hadn't seen that. And it was delightful to be in such a place where I was so foreign. Mhm.
My husband experienced the same thing on his first trip to China. He was over 6'2", so he was tall
Sure.
among the people, and they wanted to touch his skin, to feel the whiteness of his skin. So that was interesting.
Yeah, at least in those days, and it may be better now, the nutrition wasn't so good. And when I played pickup basketball all through China, I played center, and I'm not 6'2", good ways lower, but it was a delight.
Well, it's such an education. You just can't beat travel for showing you how the rest of the world lives.
Hmm. And the book, um, Moonlit Path, that I ended up spending quite a long time off and on writing about it, um, is a woman's journal in 1914. She's 32, has her 33rd birthday after a while. And she's a painter. She's the daughter of a prominent lawyer who actually fought in the Civil War when he was young, and she's a painter, to the point where she sells some paintings, but she's not famous or anything, and an avid gardener. And I had no idea of writing such a book until I happened to live in Oakland. There was a huge mansion that somebody had built back in the day for his daughter when she got married, and some students in Berkeley in the 60s bought it and lived in it. And then when some moved out and some others moved in, they just paid on the rent. And after decades, they had like 38 owners who couldn't agree on the price of bread, trying to figure out what to do with this house, which the most recent occupants of had stopped paying rent, stopped paying tax, and said, we don't believe in private property, and they'd had to evict them. And various friends who happened to be owners of the house, it was in a bad neighborhood in Oakland. Um, they wanted somebody living there, and I had just come back from somewhere to the Bay Area. So a good friend of my sister's said, why don't you stay there? So I was living in this huge mansion um, in San Francisco. And one day I was out gardening in the front, and a little black kid came by and was curious what I was doing. And obviously, to me, I mean, I grew up with black kids, and I've been a civil rights worker. You know, it ain't any big deal in this day and age. But for some reason, I started imagining a woman in an earlier time, and she's gardening, and she probably never talked to a black person. And this kid comes up to her, and then I sort of started, whether I started thinking or she started coming to me and talking to me. I don't want to make it all, like otherworldly. It wasn't, but I didn't feel as if I willed it. It was more somebody like, here I am, and I want to be heard. And I didn't even know at first when it was or anything about her. Turned out 1914. And then I obviously did a tremendous amount of reading and research as well, um, and just would sit in the Library of Congress and read old stuff. And if she reacted to it, I wrote about it. And if she didn't, I didn't.
I love hearing how authors come up with their inspiration for these stories. Some of us dream very vivid dreams and wake up and have to write something down. And some almost have daydreams or they're inspired by the history in their family. It's just so interesting to me. What do you think
Well,
is the most
I,
challenging part of your artistic process?
um, I'm tempted to say marketing it because that's what I'm no good at and haven't really done much of. Um, I think obviously this presented some extra challenges. Uh, she was a woman, and I never have been, and I've never walked the earth in 1914 either. And so if we're writing a novel set in 2024, we kind of know what people might be talking about, Trump and whatever, and Biden and the border, and we know what the issues are. And we can probably, if you tell me a sentence about what you believe, I can probably list 6 or 8 other things, maybe 24 other things that you believe passionately or don't, and I'll be right on 23 of them. And we know the language. Um, we know how the different slang that people are using now and ways of speaking or not speaking, and just looking at somebody in a certain way, and trying to kind of get acclimated to all of that so you can create characters in 1914 and they really are like people then. um, is the hard part, I guess. Getting the facility, because you could sit down and write a contemporary piece of fiction very quickly. I mean, it may or may not be good, but you can certainly figure characters, figure what goes with what. Um, for example, if you look back at that period, which was pre-prohibition, but they were pushing for it, and some states had it. Um, we think of prohibition as kind of conservative and stupid, and I don't want to equate the two in case somebody's listening and doesn't see the, or you doesn't see the things the way I do. But we know what goes with what, in the sense that here, if somebody's pro-life, they may also be anti-capital punishment, odd as that might seem to a visitor from 21, 22. Um, and when you look back, people saw the beauty of the possibility of prohibition. They saw, at least for the working class, they saw drink as a way that big brewers and saloon keepers were profiting off the poor and getting their money before they could go home and give it to the wife to buy milk with. And they thought they were doing a wonderful progressive thing. Didn't work out that way. So trying to figure out sort of who would say what and how would they say it, um, is a challenge. It's great fun.
And you mentioned publicity, and even the big five publishers are requiring their authors to do most of the legwork and do most of their marketing. Have you found any publicity that's worked for you, or maybe something you tried that didn't work?
I really have hardly tried it. I mean, I've read it at a couple of bookshops, a couple of book clubs have read the book, and I have talked with them, and one of them put it on videotape. I I have not figured out. A lot of people who read it end up liking it a lot, but there aren't a lot of people ever find out it even exists. So I have no words of wisdom for marketing except that one should do what they tell you to do, and I didn't do. Line it all up before you put the book out. We're in a big rush to put the book out. I want, Catherine's talking to me and she wants to be heard by the world, and I got to get her out there. Um, but a lot of the things that people might do, like review the book or do certain kinds of marketing, uh, they will start doing before it comes out. And you should start on the marketing 6 months before the publication date. Um, I had no clue of that when I was finishing the book, and then when I was finished, I wanted it out there. And it doesn't work that way. And no matter how good your book is, and obviously I think mine's not too bad. If nobody knows about it, they're not going to read it, and they're not going to know about it if you don't do something. And I actually checked with a couple of people who help market things now, and some of them were like, "No, it's too late. I'm only working on things that are before they publish." So,
That kind of disturbs me because I know we're supposed to do all of that 6 months in advance. And some writers will say, well, I can't be on your podcast because that will be after my launch. And I'll think, well, I'm discovering books years
right.
after they've been published now. And I don't think we have to rush and get it all done and think our book is dead 6 months after it publishes, because people are finding our books many years
Yep.
later. I just read a book from 1925. So these are legacies, and they're going to be out in the world a long time, even after we're gone. So I think getting the book out there and having Catherine speak to the world is very important, and it's going to be significant in the future.
Well, some people have certainly liked hearing her voice. Mm.
Well, let's hear her voice. Let's let you tell us a little bit about the passage you've brought to share today, and then read so we can hear that voice and tone in the book.
Okay. I mentioned that she's an artist, and just about everything that happens in the book is real. Like I was thinking about reading a passage where she actually goes to a trial, which women didn't do in those days. And she's writing about what happens to the woman who's on trial for killing her pimp. She writes about her life in Oakland. She lives in Oakland. She lives not super privileged, and she's a little rebellious, but she's basically lives within the parameters of, you know, this is 1914, and she's sort of middle or upper middle class and more or less bound by the constraints. So one thing the one thing I didn't make just as it was in reality is there was a big armory show you may have heard of, art, in 1913, and I needed it to be in 1914, so I made up one like it, a repeat. And she's early on, she's saying, I'm going to go to that. She's just really, that's the one thing she's going to do for herself is go to this huge, they're going to see the Impressionists and other painters from Europe for the first time, all kind of the Cubists, whatever. And she's excited about that. So she finally does go to Chicago in the beginning of September. And she describes being at the museum for a while, or the show. And she has a particular oddity about museums, which is she sits and she'll, instead of walking through it as we do, she'll just find a bench and sit there for quite a while, uh, studying the painting and letting it grow on her, whatever. And everybody else just walks past her, walks on her way, whatever. And she happens to notice somebody else doing that. At first, she thinks there must be something wrong with his legs, but he's actually, of all things, a Negro. Um, and so she notices him, and their eyes kind of meet when somebody gets in his way, so he uh, can't see the paintings. It was such a glorious day that I decided to walk to the park with my lunch. At the first park bench I passed, I saw the Negro from the exhibition. As soon as I saw him, I glanced away without thinking. He had evidently done the same, each of us aware that if we acknowledged each other, there might ensue some awkwardness about whether I might join him on the bench. A few steps later, I turned back and asked just that. Certainly, ma'am. He rose courteously to his feet, just like any gentleman, and gestured toward the bench. His voice was deep, and his accent Bostonian, which surprised me. I do not know why I chose to join him. I was curious about the anomaly of a Negro at such an exhibition, yet it might have proved terribly awkward if he were not intelligent or well-mannered. I realized how startled and disapproving my friends and family would be to see me sitting on a park bench chatting with a Negro, but I decided that I had every right to sit with anyone I chose and braced myself for a possibly awkward time of it. We had rather a delightful conversation. He too was looking forward to the Monet and holding off until a weekday when there wouldn't be so many people, and he made some sensible observations about the way they have organized the exhibit. Having attended the Armory show last year, both in New York and Chicago, gave him an interesting perspective. After a few moments, we fell silent. I heard, then saw, an indigo bunting on top of a post and wondered how soon he would fly south. I had begun to question whether we would renew our conversation when I heard him chuckle. I have rarely seen a white person invest the time to savor a painting as you do, he said. White folks seem always in a terrible hurry. I laughed, as I too always wonder how anyone could dash through an exhibition in a morning and suppose they have experienced anything of it. But it had not occurred to me to associate it with race, and I said as much. I have been to many museums and galleries, and almost all of the people in attendance are white, and everyone is in a great hurry, he said, smiling, then added, of course, many of the people who see my own work are black, and they hardly study it with the care I thought it deserved. However, I have always attributed that to some inadequacy in my work. Your work. Do you paint? I must have let my surprise show, for he laughed again. Indeed, they make brown-handled brushes just for the likes of brown-fingered painters, a company in Charleston, South Carolina, he quipped. I burst out laughing. His response was frank, but his eyes said he meant no harm. In most southern states, it's illegal for a Negro to paint with a white-handled brush, he went on, his tone light but edged with pain, even anger. Californians are more concerned with the colors at the other end of the brush, I replied. He smiled, and I asked him to tell me more about his painting. Wholly to my surprise, we had a thoroughly invigorating talk. Despite our differences, we have wrestled with many of the same questions, and much of what he said I have attempted to convey to friends, yet not half so well. We live in a continuous flow of impressions, from which one impression suddenly speaks to us in such a way that we must arrest the entire flow to let that one impress itself on our imagination. Because it is not a choice we make, but a choice the moment imposes on us. We take it for in Because it is not a choice we make, but a choice the moment imposes on us, we take it for inspiration, and it inspires in us absolute devotion. I nodded, but did not dare speak. Of course, I stole all that from Arthur Ransom, he said with a disarming grin. He calls it a promise we make to the moment, or it to us, and says that the real artist seeks only to be true to the original promise, and that with a good artist, we cannot discern with what he began. I had to repress the urge to find an empty bench so that I could reflect on what he was saying. A painting captures a moment when we are most truly alive, he added. I felt very much that way about this moment, sitting on a bench in Chicago with a Negro who spoke with poetry in his voice. Life was presenting me with a moment in which I could feel with a special clarity what it is to be alive and to be an artist. I sat back and let myself enjoy the rhythm of his voice and the play of sunlight on his face. As he spoke about the flow of time, my mind flowed back across the many moments that had brought me here, and I wondered what flow had brought him to this same place. I mused on chance, on the fact that I would not be sitting here if I had walked in a different direction, or come to Chicago a week later, or if Aunt Agnes had accompanied me. I wondered where he had been educated. I considered his obvious intelligence and felt ashamed to have feared that he might speak some unfathomable dialect. I thought about his color, dark enough that I had immediately supposed he was a Negro, but light enough that he might have been a dark-skinned foreigner. How odd that a slight difference in skin color can mean so much. I thought of Pudd'nhead Wilson, which I read at age 11 when it was first published, and that wonderful Kate Chopin story. It was well into the afternoon before we returned to the exhibit.
That is such a powerful scene and so subtle. You work it so subtly, but there's so much there to digest. And I always think about the people who went outside their norms many years ago and how they had the bravery to do so. And I often wonder if I would have been one of those people or if I would have followed the norms of society.
Well, you might enjoy this book because she does. Um, but it's not like she's an adventurer from the beginning by any means. And it's, you know, part of the problem with the book for some readers. She does some things near the end that are not really expected of. I mean, she's shocked by her conduct. Um, but I need to set up the time and her character um, enough to make the person reading it feel how far she's had to go. Not because she decided, oh, this is the right thing to do, or had any, one thing you have to do is make sure people in 1914 aren't thinking the way later generations will. But I think yours is a great question, and who knows how we might have been paved at an earlier time, um, and brought up in earlier circumstances, and brought up to take those as a given. So she transcends hers, but I have to set hers up first, um, to get us there, if that makes any sense.
Did you complete your historical research before you began writing the book, or did you do it as you
No,
went along?
no, I actually conceived this book. I had been living in that house around 1995 to 1997. And so that's the first stirrings of the book. And I probably actually started it a year or so later. Um, and I did a lot of research in the Library of Congress in around 2000, in the early 2000s. And I had written some. I also read the daily newspaper, the Oakland Inquirer, for 1914 over in the Oakland Library. But, kind of, I had written parts of it, but I was still going to the Library of Congress and maybe researching a particular point, or just getting a particular magazine from that time, and just kind of, as I say, let things wash through. And if I saw how Catherine might respond to it, and you know, then wrote it. And so I spent some time in DC. I'd motorcycle down the Library of Congress and research all day, but then sometimes in the evening I'd write. And then I put the thing away because I had in mind what I talked about earlier, the idea that, publishers take only what they see they can market. And this ain't it. You know, gee, a girl's diary about her garden in 1914. Yeah, have you got anything about football? Not that I don't love football, but um, so I put it away. And then a wonderful woman came into my life. She's still in my life and is now my wife, but she read everything I'd written, and she said about this, and it was pretty much finished, not 100%, but she liked it. So I got back onto it and kind of finished a draft. And then when we moved to Las Cruces, back here for me, and here for the first time for her, I was in a writing group and showing them some other more current work. And she said, why don't you run this by them? And they liked it quite a bit. And so and my wife did a great deal of work to make it sort of technically ready to go to a publisher. And also advising me about, I'm not sure a woman would put that in her diary. um, anyway, so I was still writing bits of it 20 years after I started it, or whatever it is. So, um,
I think it's great to have a partner who will join in with you and help advise or give you some ideas about how to go in a different direction. That always is so helpful.
she's a wonderful writer in her own right, and a great editor, and not shy about taking me to task. And in particular, and this gets mentioned early on, so it's not um, letting people know things ahead of time that they wouldn't know till later in the novel. But there's certainly an issue about somebody getting molested in the family, a young girl by an uncle, and how to deal with that. And one of the things that we talked extensively about, and I changed some points about, that does some things to you. And, it basically dealt with, made some changes in terms of the extent of the abuse and how it affected her. Uh, I'll leave it at that, but
Yeah, sometimes for the rest of their lives.
Hey, not to plug somebody else's book, but we have a poet here whose father abused her for years, and she's written a lot of poetry about it, but it certainly still affected. My sister had an uncle just fondle her, not anything extreme, when she was 13 or something. I've forgotten. And that affected her for the rest of her life. And it's
Just
something most guys don't have a real good sense of, I guess.
just unbelievable what goes on in life and what people have to endure or try to escape from and the scars that they leave.
Yep. And I'm examining that in the rather long project I'm working on now, fiction wise. But
Well, what does writing success look like to you personally?
um, obviously I'd be delighted if more people read it, but that's partly because I'm saying some things in there that maybe I didn't know I was saying, but that, I like people to hear. And people's response who have read it, um, I mean, in a sense, that's writing success. When somebody comes to you and said, I didn't think I was going to get through it. Some woman's diary, but kind of hooked me, and they point to a particular passage or a particular idea where she's musing about the garden, say, and has some thoughts. Um, and obviously, I would like to have everybody reading it. And part of that is not just for Catherine, but obviously for me. I got ego like everybody else, and I could use money like everybody else. But to me, writing success, if you really want to get precise about it, is the times when I have sat down to write a scene in the morning, and then when I read it, I get shivers, and I'm like, wow, wow, it's really there, and it shouldn't matter if anybody else ever sees the goddamn thing. But then secondarily, um, certainly talking with writers groups or others who've read it, um, and they tell me their feelings about it. I guess that's writing success, and it's just fascinating to hear their ideas about it, some of which are different from what I might have thought, or it affects them in an unexpected way. Um, writing, writing success is getting back to this desk every morning, which I don't manage because of all the other nonsense I'm doing in life. But it's getting to this desk and staying at this desk until something happens.
Well, when that something happens, and like you said, when it flows out of your imagination onto that page, it's really magical. And I just love that when we're amazed by our own work and our own words and we don't know where they came from. Well, Peter, this has been a great visit with you here today. And as always, our last interview question on Authors Over 50 is: our writers over 50 are quite unique. Do you have advice for writers 50 and above?
Uh, I suppose I do. Uh, First of all, stay in shape, physical shape, or get back into shape if you're not. I think that's really critical uh, to being the best person you can be and living longer. And I'm addicted to exercise. Also, obviously, writer of any age, just sticking to it. And it gets either harder or easier for people our age. I mean, we've usually left behind our day-to-day work, going to an office daily or whatever it may be. Um, but there's also so much going on and so many temptations. Um, but I guess what I'd say is write for yourself. Um, and if you love it, even though it's sometimes hard and miserable and whatever. But if you basically love it, keep doing it. And if you don't, do something else. Um, I'm not sure if that's really advice, but
It definitely is. And that's why I call it Writing in Life's Sweetest Third, because we can do it for the rest of our life, just like swimming. And I'm interviewing people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and they're still turning out beautiful work. So we're just excited to have you with us here today. And now we can call you one of our authors over 50.
well, thank you. And I sure enjoyed talking with you, and have a great day.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's D-A-I-L-Y, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.